Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and our tutorial series on World in Flames Collector's Edition. Now today we're going to start to take a look at the end of turn stage. So far we've covered the beginning of the turn as well as all of the land, air, and naval subsystems that you use during the action stage, which constitutes the bulk of each turn in World in Flames. Now with the end of turn stage, we're moving into more of an administrative part of the turn where you'll conduct things like production, handle U.S. entry, and check for conquest of various countries. Now, the one thing we do prior to the start of the end of turn stage, it's actually the last step in the action stage, is to check for the end of the action stage. So let's see how that works. Now, the last thing you will do as part of your impulse after you've done any reorganization is to roll one die to test for the end of the action stage. You'll simply look at the number located in the lower right-hand corner of the box that the impulse marker happens to be in. You'll roll one die, and if the die roll is equal to or less than that number, the turn actually is over, and you'll move on to the end of turn stage. So in this case, we have impulse number 10. The Axis have just completed their impulse. They would then roll 1d10, and they roll a 2. Looking at the impulse track, you can see the 2 is less than the 4, which indicates that the action stage is now over. The Allies will not be able to conduct any more impulses this turn, and then we will move on to the end of turn stage. Now, if the die roll is greater than this number, you simply advance the impulse marker as many boxes as the weather chart indicated at the beginning of the impulse. You can see here that would be the circled number here indicates how many boxes it moves forward. And if you have any questions on that, you can consult our episode on the initiative and beginning of the turn stages. Now you can see that the impulse track, we have NA in the first 4 boxes here, which basically means that the turn cannot end when the marker is in any of these first 4 boxes. This will guarantee a certain minimum number of impulses that will occur each turn. You also see a -1 and a 0. How can you roll equal to or less than a -1 or 0 on a 10-sided die? Well, keep in mind that if all the powers on one side choose the pass impulse type, you will subtract 2 from your end of turn die roll. So therefore, if all of the allied powers, say, were to choose a pass action in the 5th impulse, they could end the turn if they roll a 1 on the end of action die roll test. And likewise, they could end it on a 1 or a 2 if it were the 6th impulse. Also, if all of the powers on the same side choose a pass action except for 1, you would subtract -1 from your end of turn die roll. Now, having established that the turn is indeed over, we move on to the end of turn stage. And the first step in the end of turn stage is Partisans. Let's take a look at Partisans now. Now, to resolve the partisan phase, it's a 2-step process. First, you'll need to determine which countries or regions are eligible to receive partisans this turn, and then you will go through and make a second die roll for each individual country to see whether or not partisans actually show up. For the first part, you're going to need the partisan table, which is found on the player aid. One player, and it doesn't matter who, will roll one die, which will tell you which row of the table you will consult. Each row lists 9 different countries or regions that may be eligible to receive partisans. For example, if a 5 is rolled, you would consult the 5 row here, and you see we have Sweden, Italy, Bulgaria, Poland, Yugoslavia, Iran, the Philippines, USA, and USSR. You'll note that there are countries in green and countries in red. The countries in green are only eligible for partisans if they have been conquered or if there are enemy-controlled hexes in that country. The countries in red are eligible for partisans if any active major power controls them. So for instance, if you look at India here on the top row, It begins the game controlled by the Commonwealth. Since it's in red, anytime a 1 is rolled, whether or not India has been conquered by the Axis, or if there are even any enemy-controlled hexes in India, you will roll to see if it suffers partisans. Now, having determined which of the 9 countries or regions here that do in fact meet the requirement, you will then consult the individual countries' partisan value and roll a die. If you roll equal to or less than the country's partisan value, you will be able to place a partisan unit in that country. So for that, we need to look at the map. And as an example, we will suppose that Poland has been conquered by Germany previously in the game. So let's go to the map. Here we have Poland, and for the purposes of this example, we will assume that Poland has been conquered by Germany. It's the partisan phase. We've rolled a 5 on the partisan table, indicating that Poland is eligible to receive partisans. What you'll need to do is find the the partisan value for the country, which is the number listed in this red fist for all of the countries on the map. Some countries may not have the red fist symbol, such as up here in Lithuania and Latvia. In that case, if there is no red fist, the partisan value is 1. Now, in Poland, you can see with a partisan value of 6, we would roll 1 die, and if the die roll result is equal to or less than 6, we would then place a partisan unit in the country. If it exceeds 6, there is no partisan placed, and you move on to the next eligible country for partisans. Now, there are 2 ways to modify this die roll. First of all, for every partisan unit that is currently in the country, you subtract 1 from the roll. In other words, the more partisans that are in the country, the better their chances of receiving even more partisans. The other modifier is a positive modifier, and you will add the garrison value of the country to the die roll, thus making it more difficult to place partisans. Now, speaking of garrison value, let's take a minute and discuss that, because you're going to use garrison value for a couple of things in the game that we haven't really looked at yet, but it is going to come up in another couple of episodes. So, garrison value, let's take a look. Every land and air unit in the game is given a garrison value. And this value is based on the type of unit. It has nothing to do with the combat factors on the unit, and that's important to remember. There's a chart on page 17 of the rulebook in section 9.2 that is also replicated in the upper left corner of the Pacific maps, which we see here. And this basically lays out the garrison values for all of the units in the game. Now, if you are using the division and artillery or artillery optional rules, each of those will count as 0.5. Your armor HQs, armor, mechanized, mountain, or SS units have a garrison value of 2, while all your other land or aircraft units have a garrison value of 1. So most of your units will count as 1. And if you are playing the classic version, you obviously will just ignore the top line here, since it doesn't apply because you're not using any divisions. Partisans also have a garrison value of 0. So what you will do prior to rolling the die to check for partisans is total up the garrison value of all of the units that are in the affected country. Let's see what that looks like in our Poland example. Here we have a random assortment of German units that just so happen to find themselves in Poland during the partisan phase of the turn. Now, there are 2 important things to remember when calculating garrison value. In order to count towards the garrison value, the unit must be face up and cannot be in an enemy zone of control. So in this case, the face down infantry corps and the face down land bomber here will not count towards the garrison value. It's also important to keep in mind the restriction about being in an enemy zone of control, because this will have an impact when you're fighting in a country like the Soviet Union or China. All of your frontline troops that are facing the enemy and in their zones of control will not help prevent partisans from appearing behind the lines in that country. So you will have to maintain a decent rear area garrison. Now, from the chart, we know that the SS unit will count it as 2, The armor corps has a value of 2, and then we'll get 1 each for the 2 militia corps. That gives us a garrison value of 6. And since you add 6 then to the die roll, even on a die roll of 1, the lowest possible result would be a 7, which is greater than Poland's partisan value of 6, which means that with a sufficient garrison value, it is possible to prevent the possibility of any partisans appearing in a particular country. Now, this is usually a situation that the Axis can attain early on in the game, but as they continue to conquer more and more countries, that will require more and more garrison troops, as well as the Allies building up their armies and the front line requiring more troops, it will become very difficult for the Axis to maintain a partisan-proof garrison value in all of their conquered territories. And since the Germans rarely have the luxury of a spare armor corps lying around to do nothing more than garrison a particular country, if we were to remove the armor corps from this example, we now have a garrison value of 2 for the SS corps plus 2 more for the militia, giving us a total of 4, meaning on a roll of 1 or 2, a partisan unit may be placed in the country. Assuming that the Germans are unlucky enough to have a 1 or 2 rolled, let's take a look at the partisan placement procedure. Partisans in WIF are represented by these generic counters. They're kind of a mustardy yellow color, and you do want to note that they do have yearly dates on the back of them. I have the post-39 partisan counters laid out here by year, and I've put all of the 1939 and earlier counters in the cup. When you do your yearly force pool additions, you will simply add the appropriate partisan counters to the partisan force pool, and then when a die roll indicates a partisan unit may be placed, you simply randomly select 1 partisan unit from the partisan force pool. In this case, we have selected a 0 combat strength 2 movement partisan counter, and we will place that in the affected country. Now, you will notice that while the partisans start off fairly weak in the early years, as the game goes on, the partisan counters can actually become a bit more of a threat, with the late war partisan counters being often as strong as a lot of the garrison and militia corps that you find in major power armies. So the best thing for you is to avoid partisans if at all possible. But in the event that you cannot and a partisan unit does appear, after selecting the counter, if it's a green country, the country that controlled the nation prior to it being conquered will control and place the partisan. And there are a few restrictions on placing partisan counters, so let's see what that looks like on the map. Since Poland had been aligned with and controlled by the Commonwealth prior to being conquered by Germany in this example, the Commonwealth player would be the one to randomly select a partisan unit from the force pool and place it in Poland. When placing a partisan unit, it may not be placed in an enemy zone of control or an enemy-occupied hex, which means it's conceivable that it may not be able to be placed in the country. If that's the case, then the partisan unit is returned to the partisan force pool and you move on to the next country. This is, in effect, another way to partisan-proof any conquered countries by simply zocking in every hex of the country, although it's rather impractical unless you're talking about small countries like Belgium or the Netherlands. Now, once the unit is placed, the partisan units will have various effects. What are those? It's important to keep in mind that partisan units do not themselves change control of whatever hex they are in. Neither do they exert a zone of control into any adjacent hexes. They only have a zone of control in the hex they occupy. So in this instance, the forest hex here in Poland is still considered to be German-controlled, not Allied-controlled. Partisan units do prevent movement of enemy units or resources through the hex they occupy, unless the enemy units are conducting an overrun. The partisan unit will prevent the use of any resources or factories in any hex that they occupy. You cannot trace supply through the hex that the partisan unit occupies. Also, any aircraft or naval units in the hex will be considered overrun, which means unless you have the airfields garrisoned, or at least in a zone of control, partisan units can in fact destroy face-down aircraft. So if the Germans had instead had the garrison corps one hex to the east, the Commonwealth player could have chosen this hex to place the partisan counter in which case the land bomber would be destroyed and placed back in the force pool. Any pilots, if you're playing with that option, would go onto the pilot's available track. Now, one last effect that partisans have is that green country partisans do allow friendly units from their same country only, not from allied countries, to debark from either a naval transport or an air transport in their hex, rather than having to invade and fight the notional unit or paradrop and fight the notional unit. Some nations have very high partisan values. As you can see here, the USSR has a partisan value of 20. And when rolling to determine if there are any partisans, not only do you get to place one unit if the modified roll is less than or equal to the partisan value, but for every 10 less than the partisan value, you may place an additional partisan unit. So it would be very possible for countries like Russia or maybe even France, which has a partisan value of 15, for you to place 2 or more partisans in the same turn. Now, once placed, partisans can move anywhere in their country. Green country partisan units can cooperate only with units from their country. So in other words, if a partisan unit is placed in the USSR, it can only cooperate with Soviet units. Red country partisans can only cooperate with other partisan units. Partisans are never removed when their country or their controlling major power is conquered. Once they're on the map, the only way to remove them is to hunt them down and destroy them in combat. And the only way to keep them from coming back is to maintain a sufficiently high garrison value, which is often far easier said than done. That's going to do it for partisan rules in World in Flames. Now, because of their unpredictable nature and their ability to unleash a nasty surprise if you're not careful, it's vitally important, especially for the Axis powers, to always be aware of your garrison situation in your conquered territories. Otherwise, you may see production interruptions or your nice expensive aircraft go up in flames on the runways. Now, once you have resolved the partisan phase, the next step is to move on to U.S. entry, and that's going to be the subject of our next episode. So stay tuned for that. We appreciate you watching today. If there are any questions you have on partisans, or if there's anything that I put in here that wasn't quite clear, let me know in the comments and I'll be sure to answer you. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.